you, everyone. Um, I made a PowerPoint today.
Hey.
I don't like PowerPoint. I really, really don't like PowerPoint, but I decided it would probably be more effective. I really wanted to make one. So I wanted to start by saying I think this year started with kind of two pretty important events, especially just for me in my own kind of life of faith. And obviously, the first one was the Chumbo team coming. Um, and kind of giving the lectures on the Chambumoron. And it was it was honestly the first time I think we've had an official kind of lecture or workshop or presentation about the content of the Chambumoron. And just a little bit of background, I think I've explained this before, but when I was talking to Munim Pyo about coming to Ireland, he was kind of asking, how are the members and, have you guys done any kind of Chambumoron education? And we only had time to really do like a weekend workshop. So usually they would focus it on kind of Chumbo Providence and the Chumbo lectures, especially for a shorter weekend workshop. But actually, I myself had a lot of questions about the Chumbo one. So I was asking him, and I was explaining that here in Ireland, we hadn't really gotten anything, right? We just kind of heard rumors, or we had the pink book that a couple of us had read. And everything else we kind of heard from other people who had gone to workshops and stuff. So he kind of felt very inspired to try to do the workshop. But for him, what's very important, he said usually they do it over 1 or 2 weeks because they really feel it's important to have the live lectures from the professor in Korea, the one who's kind of spoken to Mother the most about it and who's done the most presentations. Um, but then they also have to organize a translator, and then there's two other professors they usually bring in, right? And it's kind of quite a lot of content, and then to have a lot of kind of prayer and reflection in between. Um, but he felt inspired to see if the professor was available, which he was. I offered to do the translation, and then two professors were available, and so we ended up doing it, right? And for me, because I could do the translation, I don't know how well it came across for everyone else, but for me, I could almost really focus on the content, really hear it, hear what the professor was saying, and have to really think about it and digest it because I had to say it back, right? And so I feel like I had a very unique opportunity to really absorb the content very quickly, right? And kind of directly from the the source of the kind of the professor and the lecture. Um, and then I felt also the Q&A session was very, very good, right? And I think for me, I was very kind of impressed or very grateful that the professors were very sincere, right? They were kind of really sharing their heart. I felt like they were being very, very honest, right? And then the Q&A session I felt was really good because it was anonymous, right? So people could just ask honestly their questions. And it was a live Q&A, so the professor there could just answer honestly, right, in front of everyone. And it was a kind of back and forth, right? So I felt it was kind of the best way we could learn the Chambumoron. And then, of course, I've been reflecting on it for a long time since I first kind of heard some of the content coming out. But I was glad to kind of get it in this form, right? And to really be able to have a kind of more direct um, education about it. But I do know it's a challenge, right? It's been a challenge for me. I think it's a challenge for a lot of our brothers and sisters because it is something different, right? And it is something when it comes to our lives of faith and what we believe and how we act based on our belief. In many ways, that's a very personal journey. It's a very personal thing. Even before Champumoran, even with what Father said, Hundoke, the principle, everyone believes it's slightly different, right? Everyone has different interpretations and it impacts the way they live their lives in different ways, right? So even though we all believe in the blessing, believe in true parents, and believe in the principle broadly, the way we believe in that and the way we imply it in our daily lives is obviously very different, right? So faith is something I know is very personal. It's very personal for me. It's very personal for each person. But I did feel like it's important that we kind of share about it and talk about it, right? And that we support each other on the journey because faith is what kind of ties us together as a community. And it's what gives us a shared sense of purpose. And it's kind of the basis for why everyone's in this room right now on Sunday morning. It's this shared faith. Even though all our faiths are slightly different, there's a shared faith that we're all sitting here and practicing together. So I wanted to share my reflections because it's been a journey for me, and I hope my reflections are helpful for each of you in your own journeys of faith. And also on the other side, I know I'm often very busy. It might be hard to make time with me, but I really, especially on things like this about our faith and our internal struggles, I really want to make time to sit down and share maybe more deeply with people. Because this service, it's a one-way conversation. I'm talking, right? Maybe a little heckling sometimes, which is fun. A unique element of our Irish community. But genuinely, like sometimes you need a conversation, right? You need a back and forth, you need a one-on-one discussion. And so I really want to make time. And today, we have our membership meeting at 1, but after that, I actually have a few hours. So I'm very happy to try to make some time to maybe go deeper into some of these points. Because I'm not going to rehash the lectures. I know some people aren't here for them.
12:30.
It's going to be tough to do it at 12:30, but you might have to miss it. Sorry. So we'll do so I'm just gonna kind of give the top line stuff. And if it's something maybe you didn't hear in the lectures or you have more questions about, that's why I want to really make time to maybe go deeper into it. But I do think some things were very, very clear from the workshop. And so those are kind of the points I just want to share my reflections on. So if we go to the first slide, one of the questions I had when I heard the content from Chambumoron is, did this really come from mother? Right? Is this true mother saying this? And what is true mother actually saying? Right? And this is the problem when there's a lot of rumors or people are teaching different things, right? With the divine principle, we have a book, we can read it ourselves. We'll pundake, we open it up, we know exactly what Father said. So that's kind of what we're used to in terms of our life of faith and our spiritual growth. So when Chambumoron content first started coming out, it was very like one person gave a lecture, you couldn't get the slides, right? Or then there was a rumor that mother said this in a meeting. So it was very unusual for us, right? And it was very difficult to interpret what was really happening. But it reminds me when when we changed the end of the prayers, right? When I read that memo, I had a very negative reaction, and I was like, who made this up, right? Who sent this out? Which leaders, I was like, is some leader trying to like get us to worship Mother Moon, right? And I sent Dr. Balcom a message like, where did this come from, right? It felt, it just felt so different, and I felt like we were going backwards, right? But then there was a service with Mother the next day, and Mother in Korean very clearly was explaining this change, right? So I really had to kind of reflect on my reaction, right? And understand, okay, it is coming from Mother. So what does that mean, right? This is a direction from Mother. So the first thing that came across very, very clear over the weekend is the Chambumoron content, especially the way it was described from the professors, came from Mother, right? It absolutely came from Mother. And actually the most clear example of that is the second lecturer, I think it's Reverend Jew, is that right? Anyway, the second lecturer who spoke English, he had a paragraph that he had presented to Mother, right? Because he gave the lecture he was giving to us to Mother. And Mother corrected him or emphasized certain points from that lecture, right? So he was explaining that he had presented this, and Mother said, actually, you should make this part more clear and really understand what I mean in this. So Mother was definitely This is what mothers sing, right? And I think that's a very important point because it means we have to then accept the implications of that. We have to understand that it comes from you, right? And so what does that mean that it's coming from you? So that was one of my first questions, and I feel like that was pretty much irrevocably, clearly answered through that weekend workshop. This is mother's direction, and this is what mother is teaching. So then it brings up the next question, right? And of course, this is the core of the struggle in our hearts is what mother's saying contradicting true father, right? Because that creates, well, in a way, a threat to our faith, right? It's like, can there be true parents if they're contradicting each other? And I think that's how a lot of people felt when they heard a lot of the mothers directly contradicting them. And again, my impression also, because I had a 1 hour consultation even before the workshop with President Moon, and I was very kind of blunt and honest with him, right? And I don't want to say mean, but I wasn't being nice either. Like I was being very critical because I felt it was the only chance I could be kind of because I trust him. He's like, I know him a long time and we have a good relationship. And he's a person I feel I can be more honest with, share more kind of my negative side or my critical side. So it was a very good discussion. And, he does have a very good heart and a very elderly brother heart. And he did take my criticisms, objections, and try to help me understand and explain from his perspective. And the feeling I got from him and from the lectures and actually from the Q&A is that mother is not contradicting something, right? That 95% of what mother is saying is actually fully what we've always believed in terms of the principle, in terms of the value of true parents and the value of the blessing, the dual characteristics of God, the three blessings, the four position foundation, the three stages of growth. But mother is saying that she's bringing something new, right? And that there is something that father didn't know. So there is, it's not a contradiction, but mother is saying that father missed something. And that, I think, is what makes it hard to accept. And that's where I'm saying that's where a lot of the struggle, at least for me, comes from. And so I feel there were 3 points here. And when we did the Q&A, this came up all the time. This was the Q&A that kept getting asked, right? Which is the claim is very clear, right? The lecture was very clear. The Q&A was very clear. True father didn't know this point about mother's identity and the position of the only begotten daughter. And that true mother did know and didn't tell and couldn't tell, right? And the first two actually are much easier for me to accept, right? And they're just to explain my own thinking on this is, for father to find the truth was very, very difficult, right? And one of the things about father's life story and journey that always inspires me is when father was trying to find the source of the fall, the real meaning of the fall, right? And he went into spirit world to meet with God and the saints. I think even Satan was there, Lucifer was there, right? So, and he was telling God, this is the fall of man. It's a sexual sin, that this is the core problem in the human heart comes from this relationship of Lucifer and Eve and right? And God told him he was wrong, right? And so, imagine you're a person, you might be in this position from Jesus as the Messiah, right? The second coming, and God himself tells you you're wrong, right? So like, okay, I got to go back and figure out what the truth is. And you do everything you've been doing, all your prayers, all your study, and you go back and you're like, no, this has to be the truth, right? There's no other option. And the second time, God, in front of everyone else tells them, no, you're wrong, right? And so then he goes back. And then the third time, he's like, I know I'm right. I know I'm right. This is the only answer that can exist, right? And then God's like, okay, right. Third time's the charm. I'm not gonna lie to you again, right? So, or I'm not gonna test you again. So the point about that story um, is you can see how much kind of determination Father needs, how much confidence he needs to actually be able to fulfill his responsibility, his role. And but in another interesting part of that story that I don't think is as widely known is in one of the Hunda case, Father's talking about that experience. And he was saying he was talking to Jesus about the fall. And Jesus had a lot of questions. And Jesus was asking all these questions about the fall, right? The implication being that Jesus didn't know exactly the origin of the fall. And so when I read that, it was quite surprising to me, right? Because I think we have this maybe oversimplistic view of what perfection means or what being the Messiah means or the Son of God means. Like once you hit a certain level, then you know everything, right? You're the same as God in terms of knowledge, right? You can see the whole universe and all of history. And I think that's kind of the way I've thought of it. A perfect person is basically like their eyes are open and, they can see everything and they know everything. But clearly, that story from Father implies that Jesus didn't know, right? And actually, when I rethink about it, it makes a lot of sense because in the three blessings, it's you become a perfect man or a perfect woman, but that's you represent the male side of God or the female side. But you actually can't really understand the female side of God as a man, or you can't understand the male side of God as a woman. And that knowledge and that experience comes through marriage, right? And so it would be very difficult for Jesus to understand and follow me without having ever been in a relationship, without really understanding the female half of history and of the world, right? Um, and so I can accept that actually maybe there were things Father didn't know, right? Because he's a man, right? Because um, he's fulfilling his responsibility, but he's fulfilling half the responsibility of true parents. And so I can also believe there's something that Mother knew that Father didn't. And maybe because of the context of the providence or the timing, Mother couldn't tell, right? Because just like Jesus couldn't tell his disciples or Jesus couldn't teach the principle, maybe there's something that Mother has to wait till the right time to teach. But the hardest part to accept, because this was also very clear, the Q&A, this was the most common question, right? Is that the reason Mother couldn't tell is because Father wouldn't accept it. And she knew that, right? So that makes it a little bit more criticism of Father, right? And that makes it much more difficult to accept as a theology, right? And how does that impact our faith? Because it sort of sounds like, or it does sound like, there's a little bit of disunity there in true parents, right? That there's not a perfect couple, right? Because one person has to hide something from the other, right? Um, so I can understand why this was the most common question. I can understand why that becomes quite a struggle in the life of faith. And I myself have to really think about it and pray about it. Um, but just to give my own perspective is, I think because of the context of Father's life and the way Father and Mother came together, Father had previous relationships. Father was much, much older than Mother. So it could be that even though they fulfilled the responsibility as true parents, they fulfilled the responsibility of the blessing and blessed couples, it's not 100% perfect, right? And this goes back to, again, this idea of thinking that once you hit a certain level, you're 100% perfect, right? Because that's also maybe an oversimplification of how we see the principle and learn the principle. So in my life of faith, I always kind of default to the fact that there's too much I don't know, right? That I try to be humble in my life of faith because it's very, very complicated, right? Like perfection is so much further away than where I am. I don't really know what it means, right? And so I assumed when I was younger that once you reach perfection, once you cross that 3 stages of growth and got to that top line of direct dominion, then everything was fine, right? And then it's up to everyone else. You're trying to help everyone else get there, right? And but in reality, there might always be growth. There might always be room for improvement. There might always be you can no longer sin. Your heart is now mature, but you still have to learn. You still have to figure things out, right? Um, and the way President Moon explains it that I like is not that, it's not that Father failed in his mission or that he did something wrong, because everything he did was successful, right? And we have blessed couples and blessed families, but that this missing piece could have sped things up, right? Could have made the providence a little bit smoother, a little bit faster, right? And that's why mother has to share it now before she goes to spirit world, because that little bit of difference we need to understand. It doesn't impact her and father, right? Because they'll both be in spirit world soon. They'll be a united couple. But it is something that we have to understand for how we live our life of faith. But so there was one other thing that Father said that I want to share that helps me with this context. Because he said when a couple comes together, they need to try to love each other as from the position of a child, like see the spouse as a child, see the spouse as a brother or sister, see the spouse as a spouse, and then see the spouse as a parent, right? And Father, in his own words, was explaining when he got close to Mother. Of course, it was very easy to see Mother as a child from the position of a father. It was possible to see her as a sister when they were working together, right? And obviously as a spouse, because they were creating a family and raising a family. But the hardest thing for Father to see Mother as was his mother, right? So if you think about the authority that Father had and the age difference and the experiences that, like the physical experiences Father had, that makes a lot of sense, right? And so it could be that one missing piece of the puzzle would have been hard for him to accept coming from Mother, right? While they were alive, while they were in the context of leading the church and the restoration of the world, right? So I can accept it in that context, right? But again, I'm sharing my personal reflections, right? And again, everyone's faith is something very personal for them. Right? But this brings me to my next question. But how does this then affect our community? How does this affect us as a community? Because if people can't accept Chambumoron, do we have a shared belief? Do we have a shared faith? Right? And can we work towards the same goals? Because the biggest example of this, I feel, is H1 and H2, right? Could we, if we forget about the Chambumoron for a second, could we share our community with H2 blessings and H1 blessings, right? And honestly, that's a hard question for me to answer. I want to say yes. My heart is to say yes, right? And that's what actually I had a good experience with Shinchonim, where that's what I told him. He was like, we can't just let anyone come and teach different things. I said, yes, but artistically, they're blessed couples. They're part of our community. We have to, accept them and work with them. We don't have to let them come up and give a service about H2 or H1, but we still all believe in the principle. We believe in the concept of, the three blessings and the duality of God. Like there's more that we share in our faith and in our direction that we should be able to still work together, to still support each other, to have a community where we're loving each other and helping each other and taking care of each other. So I honestly believe that nothing in the Chambumoron, and like I said, for me, I can accept it, right? But I know that that's a journey for each person, both. But the principle itself is the same, right? The blessing and the purpose of the blessing is mostly the same. Um, and I say that specifically thinking about H1 and H2, right? Because they kind of change the blessing a bit because they're changing the source of the blessing. And that makes it a bit more difficult. And then the sense of community and how we live as a community would be the same. So I'm going a little longer today than usual, but I wanted to share a framework that I like and that I adapted to try to help explain this point. I was a little bit inspired from last week, Alan's framework on um, relationships and blessings and stuff. Oh, 2 weeks ago, sorry. So the problem with frameworks, though, is they're automatically an oversimplification, right? I've worked with a lot of frameworks in my life, right? For work, for the church. Actually, even the principle itself is kind of a frame, right? The three blessings, the diagrams, the four realms of heart, the three stages of growth. They're they're a way to understand the way the world works, right? Because um, because there's the objective truth, which is very hard to explain and the way really hard to know and understand, and that's what we're trying to do. And then there's our view of truth, right, which is more subjective. And I remember when I was giving introduction lectures, I wouldn't say the new truth, right? Because truth shouldn't change. Truth should always be the truth. But I would say a new expression of truth, right? And I think it's the same when you talk about analogies in an argument. If you're having a logical discussion or you're trying to make a logical point, a lot of people use analogies, but in pure logic analysis, you can't use an analogy because analogies by definition are illogical because they don't match up perfectly to the point you're making, right? So frameworks are very similar. They're kind of a guide. Even when Alan was talking about it, he was saying, yes, this is very vague and simple. Sometimes it's a mix, sometimes it's like this, and it can change. So all frameworks are like that. But hopefully this is oh, it's already up, sorry. So I was going to show it after I gave my framework. So this is one I like, but this is for politics, right? And I don't know how many of you have seen the political compass, but it's kind of like right wing, left wing, social issues. And, so the authoritarian is there should be some rules on social issues. The purely libertarian is zero rules on social issues. People can do whatever they want. They all have agency, no rules at all, right? And then it's the left and right is more economic, right? Do you have free markets or do you have some controlled economics, right? And it's kind of based on how much authority, how much government control you move up and down, and how much economic freedom you think they should have. You go left or right, right? And what's kind of funny, if you go to the next slide, I'll just go through this quickly, is whatever quadrant you're in, you think is the right one, and you're very negative about the other ones. So there's this kind of joke about if you're in the bottom left quadrant, that's how you view the other quadrants. If you're in the bottom right quadrant, that's how you view the left quadrant. Jump to the next slide quickly. And then this is the same with, if you're authoritarian right, the divine moral majority, right? And then everyone else is dumb. And if you're on the left, top left, you're grand revolutionary and everyone else is evil. Right? So it's this kind of idea is you always see the other side as being bad. So what I try to do is I try to make a unificationist version of this. We go to the last slide here. Yeah. So I'll come out here. So this is kind of using our own more Mooney terminology. You have the vertical versus horizontal, and maybe the intellectual or more physical versus the emotional, spiritual, right? So the way I would see this is vertical and horizontal, I think, is very clear. How much you really believe in the structure and the vertical reporting line and true parents are the center. And without true parents, we can't do anything, right? Versus the super horizontal is we're all children of God. We have the principle now. We've all been blessed. So we're the masters of our own destinies and we'll restore the world ourselves, right? And then, when you hear about how people join the church, right? There's the type of character that joins because the principle makes so much sense and now they can understand everything. And the people who are just like, the members make me feel so loved and the community so beautiful and amazing, right? And so I kind of see the H2 guys up in the top left corner, very, very emotional, especially Hyungjin, but very kind of um, worship, they see fathers like the Messiah and, he's the king, right? He's the new king. So a very kind of authoritarian religious view, but a very emotional one, right? And then I might see the Chambumoron theologians maybe top right, right? It's like mother is the only begotten daughter, and here's all the logical reasons why, and it's like this is how we have to believe in order for the faith to succeed. Um, I see the H1 guys kind of more in the bottom right, right, where it's like Hyunjin is inherited true father's mission, and here's all the logical reasons why. But we're all they call themselves family church, and it's very decentralized, right? And then the emotional horizontal is, let's just be our own communities and let's just, love each other as blessed families and blessed couples and everything will be fine, right? And so it's everyone can kind of judge where they kind of feel they are. But, my own personal view is I try to be balanced, right?
You're in yellow.
Huh?
No.
I'm trying to. So the other thing is people will do their own self judgment, and then they'll also have judgments for other people. But column, good guess. We'll go to the next slide. I kind of put myself right there. I like to think I'm somewhat vertical, right? that I do care about the vertical reporting line, my central figures. I do want to follow. Um, like I do feel I need the vertical, right? I need guidance. I need some central figure. I need that vertical alignment. But yes, my faith is very much more intellectual, much more physical activities, like doing things. And I'm not as spiritual a person as I'd like to be. But I do want to try to go more towards the middle, right? Because I do feel like for me, the ideal is to be balanced, right? To have kind of this balance of harmony, right? I think if when I die, I can just write balance on my on my tombstone, or maybe the Thanos quote, perfectly balanced, as all things should be. Right? That's kind of my life mission and goal, right? But the reason I wanted to show this framework is so that we can understand that people will have different areas of their faith. They'll focus on different parts of their faith and to try to understand about each other, right? That, the framework's not perfect. I'm not presenting it as like this is how we should all think of each other, right? Or judge each other. But it's more, I want to make the point that we should be able to all still work together no matter where we are on this kind of division, right? So I'm not sure the H2 guys even fit on this one, but or the H1. But still I want them to. Like I want us to be able to be blessed families that follow the principle. On Wednesday evening, I was asked to give a talk for the prayer meeting, right? And my whole point was that when mother goes to spirit world, we'll naturally decentralize a lot more as a community, right? And it'll be a lot more. I think right now our overall church is much closer to the top. And I feel like when mother transitions to spirit, we'll move back more towards the middle, right? That's my hope, right? That's my expectation. In the email, I mentioned Reverend Ken Du, and he's been giving like a weekly service, basically, that's not too long. But at the leadership meeting, he gave a very, what I would consider, green quadrant presentation, right? It's like, don't have to witness, we just have to be strong, blessed families in our own communities, and then everyone will love us and the ideal world will come about, right? Almost more more extreme than what I would say in a service, right? So, but he's the international president, and this is what he's focused on right now. So, and even any person, this can change in one moment to another. Like I said, frameworks are just a moment in time. They're just a rough guide to help us simplify things, right? But the main point I wanted to make was to be patient with each other, right? To accept that people's faith is very different. But even with different faith, the core of what we're trying to do, people's motivation is very pure. They're trying to do God's will. They're trying to follow true parents. They're trying to understand the principle. And so whenever I'm talking to anyone, even if they're not in the church, even if they're Christians, even if they're Muslims, they're trying to follow God. They're trying to understand their value as people and how to find happiness through their life of faith. So my conclusion, and I hope some of this is helpful, but my conclusion is we have to be patient with each other and accepting each other, right? And that, obviously, when you believe something, you have to do what you believe. You have to do the conditions, you have to go to the events, you have to accept the instructions if you believe, right? But that's your faith, and that's what you have to focus on. I believe a lot of things, and that's why I do the things I do. But I don't expect other people who don't believe it to do it, right? They have to believe it first. They have to do what they believe is right and is their faith. And I think it's the only way we can actually grow and support each other and understand each other. And through that also understand God and understand his heavenly plan. So those were kind of my reflections for today. That's kind of the main points I wanted to touch on. And like I said, I'm always, I do really want to make time to meet with people if it's something they want to talk about, if it's something they want to share. Let's talk about it. Let's share. It's always a good experience for me, and so only if it'll be a good experience for you, please, you know, please ask for the time. So on that note, I will end with a prayer. Thank you, everyone, for your patience and your listening. 사랑 많으신 우리 하늘 부모님, our beloved Heavenly Parent who loves us so much. We're here together as brothers and sisters of one community. We're also here as individual embodiments of truth. And sometimes there can be some tension or some conflict in that reality, because each of us has our own responsibility and our own journey and path to follow. So I pray we can be patient and understanding with each other so that we can feel support from our brothers and sisters, and it can push us closer to you. We know ultimately each of us has our own 5% portion of responsibility that is absolutely sacred, that cannot be picked up by another person, cannot be traded or abandoned. In some ways, that 5% of responsibility is what makes us your children. It makes us unique individuals. It makes us capable of becoming divine beings. But we can always use a little help and support along the way. We can always use examples to learn from and to follow. So I pray we can be humble towards you and towards each other, but confident and strong in our value and our potential. So I just pray for each brother and sister here, each brother and sister joining via Zoom, and each brother and sister who is not here or who we don't know, but who is still a valuable part of our family, valuable human being, divine entity. So I want to close this prayer with a feeling of overwhelming gratitude, love, and pray something we can share with each other and with the world. I report this in attendance to the Holy Mother Hon, in the name of Youngil Ely Loew, the Blessed Central Family. Okay, thank you everyone. I'll invite Sharka back up.